Good day, everyone, and welcome to this installment of Story State from Mississippi State University. My name is Steve Soltis, and I'm on the advisory board for the PR department at Mississippi State, and have been involved in several of the Story State programs over the last several years. Was actually instrumental in launching the new narrative conference and festival, which morphed into Story State. So proud to see the evolution of the program and everything that the students and faculty at State are doing with this. It's just terrific. But I must say, over the years of interviewing people, I don't think I've been more excited to interview a leader from the communications space, more so than our guest today in Steve Holmes, who is head of communication for the Home Depot, which last time I checked, Steve, I believe you guys were the 17th largest company in the world. Keep me honest there. Is that right?
Well, we're 17 on the Fortune 500.
Just amazing. And if I'm doing the math, and I know you hate when I do this, Steve, but if I'm doing the math on the back of the cocktail napkin, given your stature there, and this is the 17th largest company in the world, I've got to think that makes you pretty much the senior most corporate communication professional from the great state of Mississippi. I know you don't like to be billed that way, but I'm going to say it anyway. That's the kind of gravitas we have with us here today with Steve, you all. I should also mention that Steve, back earlier in the year, after a 16-year run with the Home Depot, announced he was going to be moving on to some new endeavors that we may get into today, we may not. But he'll be leaving the Home Depot at the end of March to pursue some new exciting options, and I'm very excited for that chapter for you, Steve, and for wherever you're headed. So kudos to you. So to set this up, I want to, as I mentioned, Steve is a native Mississippian. He is Mississippi to the core. He is probably one of the best storytellers I've ever encountered in certainly in my corporate career, but also from an interpersonal standpoint. Steve and I are good friends, and full disclosure, we worked together earlier in our career at UPS when Steve came in and did some really groundbreaking, I think, watershed work in media relations and public relations and crisis communications, for that matter, which we're gonna talk about today. But Steve is also steeped in the Mississippi tradition of storytelling. His family intersects with Mississippi history, Mississippi culture, Mississippi education. Steve, I know you have a deep and abiding love for the Gulf Coast of Mississippi, which is your native homeland. And you grew up with a really interesting cast of characters in not only your immediate family, but your extended family, all which tie into storytelling, which we're going to be talking about a lot today, from the corporate framing of what it means to be a corporate communicator and a corporate storyteller. So with that, Steve, can you just kind of give us a little bit of history about the Holmes family and this rich tradition of storytelling that you came out of?
Well, first off, I appreciate it, Steve. Thanks for having me on. It's pretty cool to be doing this right upon announcing my retirement from Home Depot. And I should have brought it with me. It's out in the car right now. I haven't brought it inside yet, but I have the great glass hammer for Home Depot retirees that I was excited and just so honored to receive. And hey, look, there are great leaders in communication from Home Depot. I don't know if a lot of folks in the audience know this, and frankly, I didn't know until I had done a conference about a year ago. The head of comms for FedEx and the head of comms for Chick-fil-A are both from Mississippi as well, and just a ton of fun to meet them. And I think they would likely talk about a lot of these things in the same way I would. You bring up the family. Some of the history that I've given Steve over the years, some of it may be just that storytelling. I'm not exactly sure, but there is a deep, rich history of our family in the state. Most of my family immediate family still reside there. And although I dare mention that I'm an Ole Miss grad, at least in graduate school, I attended Ole Miss. Um, I have my grandfather went to Mississippi State. Just had a niece graduate from Mississippi State in teaching, and I have a nephew that's in golf course management out in Texas, out in Houston, and he went through the great Mississippi State golf program there. So
Fantastic.
a lot of good ties to the school as well, and definitely the state. Talking about storytelling, I thought about it, Steve, when we first talked about doing this. And, storytelling was just a part of our culture. And I think a lot of folks in the audience probably can identify with this, but mine maybe a little more Mayberry like. Um, my mother's, my grandparents on my mother's side, they're from right up the road in Amory. Much of our family roots back to Aberdeen, which is right up the road as well. And then my my paternal grandfather, he after attending Mississippi State and getting a degree in agriculture, ended up in Oxford of all places, and they were there for most of their time. And both places in Amory and in Oxford, they had these awesome front porches. And I remember growing up as a kid, going up there at the time. Frankly, we lived in Miami at the time until I was 7, um, and I would go from this big city up to these small towns, and in the afternoon, late in the evening, sitting on the front porch, and just my grandparents were storytellers. Um, my Aunt Mary Ann, who is my great aunt, um, um, she would walk me around Aberdeen. She would walk me around Oxford, and we would just go on these long walks. And it would always be, now, Stephen, and she would stop at some historical sign or whatever. Or she would see a house. She'd go, now this is where your grandfather grew up and where I grew up. And then we'd go down the road. Now this is so and so's house, and he was the first um, chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, and which is actually true. The first head of the FCC is from Aberdeen, and his home is still there. So it was always there were always stories being told, and in Mississippi, you come from there. Through that, you just gain a great appreciation uh, for narrative. Um, my brothers, three of I have three older brothers, and my three older brothers are the fifth generation of ministers in our family.
Wow.
My dad was first an attorney, and then he became a minister and a chaplain for the Veterans Administration for 30 years. And they, everywhere I looked, you look at law and you look at the ministry, and that communication was the foundation of what they do. I don't know what bearing that might have had on me. I think I just evolved into it. But
Osmosis. It's all
yeah,
around you. Yeah.
it
Surround
just
sound.
kind of yeah, it just kind of happened that way. So a great appreciation for it, and a love for it, and a great appreciation and a love for the state, which is, I would say, the most underrated state in the United States of America.
I'm right with you there, Steve. I love your native land. And I've got a pet theory, but I want to bounce it off of you about why the magical Mississippi storytelling traditions. I grew up in California and was introduced to Eudora Welty and Faulkner and others at a young age, and always had this sort of mystical, misty, Southern Gothic vibe to Mississippi in my head. And the more I learned about the state and the people that inhabit it, and you think about the two, what I and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think two of the most major influences, cultural influences, are the African American culture and the Scotch Irish culture, right? Which are both steeped in storytelling traditions.
Right.
Is
Right.
that is that where this all comes from? What else, or and what else plays into the mix here? Because I'm fascinated by it, and I also, what can corporate America learn from the Mississippi storytelling tradition?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's a big part of it. I think that the history of Mississippi is one that uh, uh, is just steeped with so many things. Uh, Lots of them not good, but it's steeped with great things as well. And there are writings on it. If you research it a bit, you can kind of learn more about it. But I like what one thing I read was talking about just the topography of Mississippi, just when you roll through the state for the first time, and it was talking about a small footprint, and yet you go across the state, and there are so many variations of topography. But then the fabric of the people that are there, and I think, um, yeah, ancestry and homeland probably has a lot to do with that. My mom's side was they're Scotch Irish, and maybe some of that is where that came from. Of course, my grandfather. By the way, I'm going to go back to the history of the family, but my grandfather my mom's dad was he was a train engineer out of Amory, and the stories he could come back with were pretty interesting too. He'd come walking through. I remember we would get there and come walking through with his lunch pail and actually wearing the engineer's overalls, blue pinstripe, and the engineer hat with the blue pinstripes. And at the dinner table with me, well, hit a log truck tonight. Back then, semis, they would go over the railroad tracks and the driver might fall asleep. He had this happen twice. One time it was a log truck, and the other time it was a load of oranges coming from Florida going up north, and everyone from town came and bagged up free grapefruit and oranges because citrus was like a real delicacy back
Sure.
then in those parts. But at any rate, I wander a little bit with that, but I go back to, I just think it's things, just the countryside and the simplicity of life, and that sitting on the front porch. And then, you think about um, the way there there were so many stories that on the negative side, with slavery and with the racial strife and things like that, that frankly a lot of people, um, most likely they didn't want to write some of that down, or um, and they told it through stories. But thank goodness, today, we have those, some of the great literaries from Mississippi. I encourage folks to research that as well, and learn about that history. It's so important for us, to help us fix it and not repeat it. And I think that that's a rich part of history to look at too. Another group, Eudora Welty. Sorry, I'm going to tell another story. Um, Back in college, we had this party that we were doing, and we wanted a slideshow, so we were just riding around town taking slides, and we're riding down State Street, and I look up, I look at the car next to us, and there's Eudora Welty driving her Oldsmobile Cutlass or whatever that was. Um, that she was driving. So in the slideshow, we had a picture of Eudora Welty driving down the street.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, she lived in a simple home in Belhaven. For those of you who don't know that, and if you don't know Eudora Welty, I strongly encourage you research her as well. Um, but I think that we talk about the great literaries of the time, but in terms of, we think of book writing and poetry and things like that, but we have such a strong legacy as a state in music. And you think about the greats like B.B. King and country music, and a former classmate of mine from undergrad is married to Carl Jackson out of Nashville, and those, both in the blues and in country music, that's storytelling at its best. It's great storytelling.
Yeah, and Steve, when you layer that on with the rich journalism tradition in the state too, right? I mean, the Clarion Ledger during the civil rights movement, and every small town in Mississippi still, most anyway, still have very thriving little newspapers, which certainly helps. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about journalism and media relations here in a minute, because your purview is the head of communications for the Home Depot, which I want to get into as well. For people who are not familiar with what does a chief communication person do at a big company like Home Depot, it's multifaceted. But before we get into that, Steve, quick question about when the lights went off for you at a young age. Was it at Mississippi College? Was it at Ole Miss? When did the lights go on for you and say, you know what, I'm going to pursue a career in public relations and corporate communications? When did that happen, and what instigated that?
Well, I mean, it actually took quite a while. And we can talk about this a little bit more in career advice, but just over time, it was an evolution. When when I got out of college, I thought I wanted to go into sales because that's where the money was. There was only one minor flaw in that plan, and it was that whenever I went to do an interview for sales, I didn't have any confidence and I didn't sell myself very well, so I never ended up getting a job in sales. I was in accounting in undergrad for a while. I took 18 hours, um, flunked my cost accounting final.
No shame, no shame.
With no shame. And I remember Dr. Park at Mississippi College, she gave me a 25. It was only 4 questions. Okay. And I never understood that accounting really was not about the numbers, it was about the theory. I probably would have done much better, but my my advisor called me in after that and said, Steve, why are you in accounting? And I said, well, I want to get a good job when I get out of college. And Dr. Roberts looked at me and said, Steve, you're not going to get a good job in accounting. So you need to do something else. So I explored lots of different things when I was first starting out. But what I always loved was having fun, joking, and making people laugh. I enjoyed doing that all the way since I was in elementary school. And I thought, advertising, that's what I want to do. And that's how I ended up in the graduate school at Ole Miss, because people said, well, journalism is a great degree to get into advertising. Over time, I learned that just through doing different things, um, I thought at one point in grad school I wanted to be a magazine journalist, and I did an internship and found out I did not want to be a magazine journalist. That was not what I wanted to do. Um, and then it wasn't until much later, after several steps in my career, um, from working in a political campaign, running communications for a congressional campaign down on the coast. Wished I'd known then what I know now. I could have done the candidate much better service, given him much better service on that front. Um, to working at the Mississippi Economic Council, kind of doing all the communications there. And then I ended up, smartest move I ever made was I had met my wife, who's my wife today. Um, and hopefully she's going to stick with me being around the house more at the moment. But I chased her to Atlanta, followed her, and I ended up at a small agency in Atlanta. And that was such a great experience. And the reason it was a great experience was because I had to do the advertising. I had to do the marketing collateral, writing collateral, brochures, things like that. We were just dipping our toe into what was then called the World Wide Web. But we were just getting into, and it was when you would just write something up and have this static page that you could go and I wrote copy for that stuff. But then I was doing PR as well, and when I ended up at UPS about 3 years later, um, I took a PR role. It was purely PR, and it didn't take me long to say, "Wow, this is what I want to do. This is what I love." I just loved it, and I liked you know, and the day to day, just day in and day out, the difference you can make. And hey, Steve, I remember at UPS, I was up there on the on the seventh floor, and y'all were on the sixth floor because y'all didn't have room for more PR people.
Right.
I started, but within about 2 weeks of Malcolm Berkeley, uh, who is to this day a very good friend like you, and he is now the chief communication officer, head of global communications at UPS. And but I think of that seventh floor, and the first time I talked to a reporter and was going to be quoted, I don't know, it was something like transport topics, but I think it was even smaller and more niche than that. And I sat back after I did that, and I said, "Man," I said, "you are responsible for what was then 300,000 employees, and doing the right thing and saying the right thing on their behalf."
Mm.
And it was nerve-wracking, and it was exciting. And I just got a bug for that at that time. And I remember while at UPS, I came home and I told my wife, um, we got married when I joined UPS. So I did the right, smartest thing I did, like I said, was chasing her to
Good
Atlanta.
man.
And I came home and I said, "Man, this is it. This is what I want to do." I just loved the whole PR and corporate communications front.
That's great. That segues into my next question for you, Steve. We talk a lot about, in fact, Story State, as I mentioned, evolved from an earlier program that we called the New Narrative, because we're looking at the transformational narrative development that was going across all companies and industries and facets of society, not just business, but in culture. The importance of telling a story and owning your story and being accountable for your story. You mentioned UPS and the Home Depot, two companies that are just absolutely steeped in storytelling traditions. I mean, UPS's founder, Jim Casey, delivering opium and whiskey on Skid Row in Seattle
Yep.
back in the early 1900s, and all the stories that evolved from there. The Home Depot and the founders of Home Depot sitting around a pancake house in West Hollywood or Santa Monica, basically scribbling on the back of a cocktail napkin about what this new company, the Home Depot, might look like. And from both of those experiences, just became these cultures of storytelling. So and you've been instrumental in evolving those stories. I want to talk about your role there, but before we get into that, just want to ask you a broad question. What is corporate narrative development? What is it? What is a company and organizational narrative? Why is it important? And what the heck is it?
Well, Steve, I think of it this way. I mean, if there's one thing that I want anyone to know about my company, tell me about this company and give me that narrative in one sentence. To do that, um, you've got to build. I refer to messaging architecture a lot. You have to start with that architecture, um, and all the other stuff. I think one of the things that we in corporate communications uh, can get into really quickly is we want to throw everything in the kitchen sink at people and not stop with that. What's that? What's that? Yeah, tell me in a sentence. Tell me what you want to know. We have an amazing growth opportunity and a bright future ahead because we have this much market opportunity and we have the best people in whatever it be, corporate America or wherever it be. And I believed, and I still believe that, um, Home Depot has the best associates in retail, for example. And you can tie that together when you structure that architecture. You can actually say in one sentence, here's what I want you to know about my company, my any organization, frankly. Then I can throw in all the other stuff. You go back to that architecture and say, you know, here are the facts underneath those 3 points that I was really making. And so I think that's how I define it.
Yeah.
I mean, very easily, very quickly. And then you have subsets that break off of that. My narrative may be only about that, why it's a growth company and what our opportunity, and then you're layering those things in. So I may only be talking about that in that point. Um,
No,
and
that's awesome. Steve, let me just
yeah,
interject here because you bring up a really interesting point about subsets. And I want to talk a little bit about your purview for the last several years as the head of communication for the Home Depot. Tell us a little bit about what you were responsible for, and then perhaps even more importantly, is how you got everybody in your organization on the same page about telling a consistent story, because I think that's something that our PR students and all of our communication students at State are working on and wrestling with, and that's what they're going to have to deal with when they get out there and and really start their professional career. So, tell us a little bit about your purview and how you maintain that consistency of message.
well, I never I never felt like we maintained that consistency of message. And I would
Fair.
imagine there's some other folks at the company that would say the same thing, but I think we did have a clear architecture built out. And it started with our CEO and what we believe the story was there. The thing that I bring that up in the beginning, not to sound as though it's failure, but that is when you're in an organization that is that big and that complex. um, it's very difficult. I think it is where the subsets are important. They need to start with what's the overarching and then get into their story. I mean, I don't want to break out and dwell on Home Depot, but in retail, you drive by a Home Depot store and you think there's a home improvement store. It's a retail store, and it's actually an extremely complex company with 500,000 people and multiple different elements to the business. Um, and it is difficult to get out of those functional silos and telling their own story. But the overarching, a big focus for us was our culture and our values and how we contribute to the community. It was made a little easier by the fact that I do have communications, and a content team and the elements that the channels that we use to communicate. So I had all the communications, internal and external, on that front. But then we had, within our group, we also had the Home Depot Foundation, which is our community work, and the events team, and as well, and some other things. But the point being, we were all together and pretty well all on the same page because we were doing on those fronts what we wanted to talk about. But again, I talk to my peers at other large companies, and even they don't even have to be large. I mean, it's difficult at any company to do that. And you can build that messaging architecture, and then your challenge is going to be, well, how do I get that architecture? How do I get everyone bought in, and how do I get everyone on that same page, as you put it earlier? Um, Honestly, I'm not so sure we ever really got there where I would want to get. And I think, we felt that way at when we were together, at UPS. You feel that way because it's a daily battle. It is a daily battle to keep that going. Sometimes it was even hard just within our own team.
Yep.
The team was over 100 people, so that's a lot of people to keep on the same page.
Yep. Well,
And
we hear a lot too, Steve, today about controlling the narrative, because if you don't control your narratives, others will control it for you. And to your point, what you just said, the pace of change that's going on in the world, the transformation that we're seeing is x-fold even greater than when we started our careers, right? So this is something that our students are going to have to deal with, and we're dealing with we're in this environment of almost constant change, constant disruption, and I would say even constant crisis, which used to be sort of a one-off word like crisis, Tylenol, this, that. It's almost like crisis is a
yeah,
four times a day event now. And I got to tell you, the world that I live in, I occupy, the people I talk to, associate with, um, have a lot of respect for. They hold you up as probably the leading practitioner of crisis communication in the country, if not the entire Fortune 500 world. And I find that interesting because most professionals that I know also run away from the fire, whereas you going back, I remember watching you at a very young age at UPS, you would run into the fire. And you touched on that a little bit about the responsibility you felt, on your shoulders of 300,000 people. Um, and your words can, literally can move markets in situations like that. So how the heck did you get involved in crisis communication, and how did it become a passion point for you?
yeah, yeah. Well, hey, look, the first thing I'm going to tell you is this. I know the people you're probably referring to that say I'm the best in the country. And there are hundreds and hundreds of best in the country at crisis communication. There are just some amazing people out there. And those people that are saying that I learned from them. So that would be the first thing I would say. I mean, I really owe it to them, and learned a ton from you too, Steve. I mean, we sat, UPS didn't have a lot of offices, and we sat cube by cube
Sure.
for most of the time. I was across the aisle, and then I got one of those window seats, and I was right there by you. But you and I would listen to the great Norman Black, who was he was the national media relations director, and a 20-year AP guy. Covered the He first covered Amy Carter and then covered the Pentagon. And just this is important, I think, for the audience to remember, for our students to remember. I learned so much just listening to him. And that is where, by the way, that is also where I have concern about this idea that some people think we're just going to go totally remote. Um, had I been at home in an office and Norman at his home in his office, those conversations that I listened in on that he had with reporters, I would have never heard. I would have never learned those things. I would have never learned from you right there next to me, and learned a lot about executive communications. Never knew one day I would have executive communications as part of my responsibility. And the things that I learned from you, I often envied because I wanted to do more of those kinds of things, but I definitely used. That's kind of a sidetrack, but I do think that is where this if you work in a remote environment, it's still, or a virtual environment, it's still important to make the most, have those opportunities to go back into the office and be with other leaders and teammates, and you learn a lot from them, because that is where you learn all of these things. And I guess the passion, when I did leave Mississippi and go to Atlanta early in my career, um, I started at a small agency. And by small, 10 people. I think it might have been 10 people.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, but just a really smart lady, that had built this agency, and we later merged with another agency, so then we ended up with, like, 35 people. We were rocking and rolling. But the cool thing about working at a small agency like that was you're thrown in the fire to do whatever they need you to do. You're not, "Hey, I need you over here pitching this story for this client." A lot of value to go into the big agencies as well, but in that small agency, I walked in the door after just being the my first title, by the way, my real job was director of corporate communications. At any rate, I walked into that agency, and the first thing they told me, my first assignment was to write a crisis communication plan for a I mean large, I think it's the largest pool and spa chemical manufacturer in the world. And I thought, what is a crisis communication plan? Uh, but the beauty of it was they had hired an outside consultant who had, gosh, probably 40 years experience in it, 30, 40 years. And I was able to learn from him. So I got thrown into it right there. And I loved it. I just loved it from the minute I got involved in that. It's very, very interesting. By the way, story time. A couple of years later, when I ended up at UPS, a certain fire happened with a this chemical company, and there were fish floating in lakes and rivers and things like that. And I thought, boy, they never told me it could be that bad.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
if you're working in crisis communication, one of the fundamental things is for someone to tell me the absolute worst case scenario. I need the raw truth. How
Right.
bad could something get?
Right.
Uh, that was not what I'd envisioned. Um, but the strategy behind it, the pace of it, the pressure of it. You know me, I'm pretty calm, and I kind of have a calmness that I take into that. I have a little exercise I do when you really have a crisis, and I've got to just step away, take a deep breath, and literally force myself into calm, because you cannot think when you're not calm.
See, let me just ask you to build on that. I'm always fascinated by by the process of crisis response and crisis communication because, like I said, most people run the opposite direction because it's scary, it's complicated. There's often not a right answer. It's often material. It can be legal. I mean, there's so many
Yeah,
scary elements. So
yeah.
when you walk away, when you go out in the foyer and count daisies or, sing a Johnny Cash song and chill out while you're thinking about this, you're not thinking about spin. What are you thinking of? I mean, because a lot of people think crisis, they think rebrand, they think spin, they think, duck and cover. What is it that's in your mind? I mean, what's top of mind for you initially? Is it getting that story out quickly and accurately and authentically? What's the process?
Well, well, there's no single answer to that because every issue and every crisis is different. It depends on what it is. I mean, um, oftentimes it is just what is the core truth here?
So true.
What really happened? What is that? What really happened? Other times it can be obvious what happened is that you completely screwed up. And in that case, it may be, and I've been through that situation where it was a rush to get an apology out. And in that case, the thought process was, um, how authentic can we be? We've got to be so absolutely authentic. And that's one of the critical things. And I think one of the things that gets missed often, especially in an apology, people aren't going to buy it if it's not authentic. And corporate speak, there's no room for it in those situations. Um, I remember we used the words stupid and insensitive in a statement that we were putting on social media, and it was, I'll leave it at that. But we were raw with our authenticity, and so that was the rush there. But then the process, boy, Steve, it's such a a long answer to it, but I think the biggest thing of all, that's important to remember with crisis and issue. Um, I was having lunch one day with an intern, and the intern asked me, she said, "How do you sleep at night? Doing what you do?" And I told my immediate reaction was, "I don't do this alone." And in crisis, that is absolutely critical. You cannot do it alone. I wouldn't have slept at night if it's all on my shoulders. You've got to partner, and that's how you get to that truth. That's how it feels like oftentimes like we're not going to be able to move fast enough. If you have a situation that is that urgent, you got to have the facts. So you're still not going to do it by yourself. But I remember I had another situation, um, and I got the facts from the source. And it was we were worried that people were going to think that POS systems were shutting down, and it wasn't nearly as bad as it seemed. It was just a glitch. But I remember I said I had an AP reporter already emailing and calling, and I didn't have time to go through this massive levels of approval and him hawing about, well, what if we said it? And I just told the reporter what I told him because we had to move so quickly. And the headline came out, and I was like, whew, you know, but we got the truth out.
Yeah.
And I think that what are the facts? What's the truth? How my drive always, and I think every organization's drive should be to how do we get to a point where we're so authentic in what we're saying and that people get it,
Yeah.
because you've got to be authentic or it's just not believable, and it just keeps going. It just keeps going. And I don't really blame people. I mean, they don't buy into it. They're like, yeah, sounds like, kind of corporate speak to me. There are situations where you you, you have come up, and oftentimes they can be in the legal situations where you kind of got to do a little more of the corporate speak, but there are,
Sure.
because there are bigger issues down the
Yeah.
road.
Steve, you mentioned authenticity and the importance of authenticity in messaging, especially in times of crisis. But also, I'm guessing there's an interpersonal component to that in building trust with people on your team and trust in you as a leader on your team. So, with that in mind, I've got sort of two final questions for you. One directed to our students, our communication students, and then a final question to our faculty. But for our students, we've got, first of all, a remarkable set, excuse me, of communication students. I'm a little biased around the PR side because I get to see them at various board meetings interacting with us and presenting, and they're, to a T, they're just fine young men and women, super smart, super ambitious. It's a long way of saying wind up, because whatever you say here, they're going to take to heart. But I want you to give them a little bit of advice, because as I know, I think most people in corporate communication or any form of communication know, landing that first job can be absolutely brutal. It's sometimes daunting. It's easy to get down on yourself. It's not easy, right? I remember I graduated from University of North Texas undergraduate in the middle of the Texas oil bust, and nobody was hiring, and it was so easy to get down. But what advice? We got a lot of students who are going to, quite frankly, want to be the next Steve or Stephanie Holmes, if you will. What advice would you give them?
By the way, my mom and dad wanted me to be Stephanie Holmes. Which is how I got the name Steven, because they had 3 boys already. They were just sure I was gonna be a
All
girl.
right, Stephanie, take it away.
Yeah. But boy, Steve, what a great point. And I mean, look, first off, it is hard to land that first job. I think if people could see what I went through to try to get my first opportunity, I believe me, I know it. I think I did 5 internships. I probably did.
That's awesome.
And I guess my big advice is you don't know where things are going to end up. If they're going to end up doing well if you work hard and you're honest and enjoy what you're doing and dedicated to it and all of those things. Sure, but keep in mind, um, just get a job, because every job you get is valuable experience.
Wow.
I remember when I was in college, and I was in grad school too. I worked in clothing stores, really nice clothing stores, and I had also delivered pizza during undergrad. I was taken off the delivery team because I did end up with one of the company-owned vehicles in someone's front yard briefly when rounding a corner a little quickly. But nevertheless, I delivered pizza. And then I mean, that job that I took with the campaign was that I didn't have anything else to do. I could live with mom and dad. They paid me $200 a week. And I
Yeah.
thought, well, I'm sitting here making $200 a week, and then I got to raise to $250 a week. And I thought, oh, what am I going to do? I mean, and then I got the next job, and then I got the next job, and at each point, I look back now and I look at, from working in a pizza shop, what did I learn? I learned a lot about customer service, dealing with other people. I learned a lot about how the back end of a business actually works. I learned that pizza is really, really cheap cost of goods, and I can't believe what we pay for pizza. But all these things, I learned different things. When I mowed the grass at the church in high school, what did I learn? I learned how to work hard, because mowing grass in the summer on a sandy lawn on the beach of Gulfport, Mississippi, with the wind blowing is not easy. But I learned to work. And then, you just learn each part of the way. And when I interviewed at Home Depot, I didn't even think to tell them that I'd worked like 6 years in retail in the interview. And I looked back and I was like, that actually was valuable experience. So just
Sure.
whatever your career is building blocks, and each thing
Yep.
you get,
Yep.
it adds up and it pays off.
I love that comment because, people get derogatory. They talk about burger flippers or dead end jobs. There are no dead end jobs.
No,
Exactly what you're saying. You
no,
learn
it's
from everything.
well, I mean, Steve, think about companies like, we've talked a lot about here because we were here, but think about companies like UPS and like Home Depot. I mean, the top leadership in the company started as cashiers and as gathering carts in the parking lot and frontline sales and different. And at
Absolutely.
UPS, they started pulling, loading trucks. They weren't
Absolutely.
even, they were loading trucks. No, every job is an opportunity to learn and get experience and build your career. I tell you, with interns, I was a stickler for any intern that we hired at the time when I used to interview them. I was a stickler that they had to have either worked in some sort of job in high school and some sort of job or some sort of job in college. And by that, I meant I don't care if you were waiting tables, mowing grass, babysitting, truly, but what have you done to learn how to work? And by the way, the other thing that you learn that is so critical is, for our world in communication, you learn to work with others.
Right.
And that in communications, you absolutely have to have that.
Yeah. No, I love
You
that, Steve.
you can't do it alone,
Yeah.
as I
Yeah.
said.
And building off that, this time directed to our faculty who are truly an extraordinary group of men and women scholars that are living their passion and developing this next generation of fine communicators. What advice along those same lines, what advice would you give to them as they're preparing the next generation in future Steve Holmes? What should they be thinking about?
Well, I think they're doing it in a big way because I know that by bringing you in and other things that they're doing there at Mississippi State, bringing in people that are practicing communication, practicing professionals in that field is just absolutely critical. I mean, you can teach fundamental things, and frankly, I think schools are doing a great job of this in on many respects. But teaching the fundamentals of how do you build that messaging architecture, and how do you write a press release? Anyone kind of a less used tool these days, but nevertheless, but those writing skills and all those fundamentals, but the actual practice of it, you learn on the job. And the closest you can get to that for your students is bringing in people that are on the job and doing that. And frankly, I don't think that it always has to be and needs to be the head of communication. I mean, look, the smartest people on my floor, they're not me. The smartest people on my floor are my team. And I have an amazing team. And one reason they're the smartest right off the bat is because they're closest to the situation.
Mhm.
They have most of the information. They're the ones that are digging things up. And those are great people to have come in and lecture and teach a class. So I think that piece of it is really important. I recently did a class for Ben Deutsch over at UGA, um, and this is another thing that I think is important. I told the class when I started out, and um, I would encourage, if they're not already doing it, the professors. I told them I only had 10 people in this session, but I said I expect a question from everyone in this class, because one of the fundamental skills that you have to have in communication is asking lots of questions. And I think flipping that back to students and driving the expectation that they are going to be inquisitive and they're going to ask questions is critically important, especially when you have a guest there. But that in itself, and look, I've been guilty of not doing that at times, and then I found myself a day later going, "Well, gee, I wish you'd have told me that." Well, you didn't ask. I didn't,
Yeah.
I didn't know that would matter. And the person on the other side actually, legitimately, they were like, "Well, I didn't know that would matter." So, encouraging to be inquisitive, and then the thing that students have us beat on, and that I think that the teachers is maybe their biggest challenge. is just keeping up with the world and the new technologies and all that. And one of the things that I'm enjoying is having more time to really dig into that and dig into unusual sources of information. I was on a session last Friday um, with about 4 or 5 people in our industry, and it was just about that. Where do you get information that you don't get anywhere? Just what are some odd places? And I thought like, for example, one of the recommendations was Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's blog. I wrote it down. I went to it. It's fascinating. It's a great read, but finding those unusual sources of information, the technologies, all those things.
That's fantastic. Well, Steve,
Yeah.
man, I know we're coming up against the hour. I so
Yeah.
appreciate the generosity of your time and, of course, your friendship. We would love to, selfishly, we would love to get you to Grounds in Starkville for an in-person engagement at some point. So,
Yeah.
no matter
Yeah.
where, I know you're hardly done. You're not hanging up the cleats. There's a lot more left in Steve Holmes, and we'll be excited to hear about what this next chapter holds for you and for Cindy. And we wish you all tremendous luck and continued success. And really, Steve, thank you so much for being part of this. You're actually a good rebel, my man. You're a good rebel.
well, I'd be thrilled to come there anytime. My mom just lives down the road in Flowood, right outside of Jackson, and anytime I have an excuse to go see her is a great time. But I'd do it regardless. So um, a lot, like I said earlier, a lot of roots and a lot of pride and a lot of respect for Mississippi State and the great work y'all are doing there to create our next leaders in communication, engineering, accounting. I should maybe have gone get an accounting there.
Agriculture, we got to feed the world. Got to feed the world, Steve.
Agriculture, my
Yes,
grandfather, yeah. So,
absolutely.
but hey, thanks for having me, and thanks for what you're doing with Mississippi State as well.
Well, thank you. It's been
Appreciate
an
it.
honor. Thank you, Steve. And
You bet.
thank you all. We'll be back probably this time next year. See you. Bye.